Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 352 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Ben Bova. He's a six-time winner of the Hugo Award, a former editor of Analog Magazine and a former fiction editor of Omni Magazine, and past president of both the National Space Society and the Science Fiction Writers of America. He's also the author of more than 130 works of science fact and fiction. And we'll be speaking with him today about his most recent short story collection, New Frontiers. And now, here's our interview with Ben Bova. All right, so we're here with Ben Bova. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Okay, so the first story in New Frontiers is about building a golf course on the moon. So how did you come up with that idea?
I married a woman who plays golf. I don't, but she got me a little bit interested in the game, and I was wondering what it would be like to try to play golf on the surface of the moon. And that's how the story generated.
And so what would it be like to play golf on the surface of the moon?
Well, in the first place, you'd be in a spacesuit because the surface of the moon is airless. And the second thing that you would feel is that the gravity is only 1/6 that of Earth. So you could hit the ball a lot farther. In fact, in the golf course that I wrote about in the story, some of the holes are over the horizon. So you really have some challenges.
Right, because the moon is so much smaller than Earth, the horizon is much closer.
Yes. But also because the gravity is so much lighter that the ball will travel a lot farther, and there's no air to impede the ball's progress. Right,
so what they actually end up doing in the story is putting sort of lights shining up so that you know, where the...
Poles. Yeah, you put the poles big enough or tall enough so that you could see them from the tee, and you put a light on top of them.
Right. Then you also have the issue that there's not really any grass on the moon.
Right. You have to fake it.
So talk about in the story how they end up actually building this golf course.
Well, they just smooth the surface, which is called the regolith. It's sort of like beach sand in composition, and you smooth it out and paint it green.
So is that something you would want to do, play golf on the moon?
I don't want to play golf on Earth, and I certainly don't want to play it on the moon.
No, it's a really interesting story. I really enjoyed that.
I'm glad you did.
And there are a bunch of interesting, scientific premises in this book that were kind of new to me. So, for example, in your story, A Country for Old Men, there's in a ship, and it has sort of a scoop to scoop up hydrogen to fuel the ship. And yes. The ship ends up passing into a region of space where the concentration of hydrogen molecules is too low, really, to keep the ship going. Is that a real thing, those sorts of low hydrogen regions of space?
Yes. There are areas of high concentration and areas of very low. And we're talking here about, maybe one hydrogen atom per or per cubic meter, which isn't enough to keep a hydrogen fusion reactor going. So you have to find more plentiful areas.
Mm-hmm. So if we were to send out a ship like that, what sorts of precautions could they take to avoid running into that problem?
Try to map out the hydrogen abundance in the region of the star field that you're going.
And how would you do that?
You look. Hydrogen gives off a signal. I think it's a 31 centimeter radio signal. And astronomers on Earth have been able to map out clouds of hydrogen, streams of hydrogen. Not in enormous detail, but the general picture. Still, in the story, they run into an area that's low in hydrogen, and this creates a problem.
Right. So how about in the story Mars Farts, you talk about methane on Mars? What is that a real thing?
Yeah, that's true. There are signs of methane. astronomers have been looking at this for some years. Methane appears in the Martian atmosphere, usually in the local Martian springtime, and pretty quickly disappears. And the question is, what creates the methane? Where does it come from? It seems to me the simplest explanation is it is the excretions of Martian creatures living beneath the surface.
Is that widely agreed upon, or do other people think it's more like...
No, nobody really has agreed that there's Martians living below the surface. But when we get there, I'm sure we'll find some. And I'm not talking about human-like creatures. I'm talking about worms.
Right, so what would be some competing theories for the methane?
As far as I know, there's been no valid theory, no reasonable theory. It just exists. It might be something completely abiological, but I haven't seen a good explanation yet. So I think my story can still hold up.
Yeah, well, certainly hope we find out about that sometime soon.
Yeah, well, when we go to Mars, we ought to keep a biologist in the team.
Would we need to send humans to Mars to find out, or is there any way that a robot could test that?
I think it probably could be done by robotics, but it's much simpler to do it with humans. Trouble is, the humans are difficult to keep alive.
Yeah.
The robots are easier to maintain.
Yeah. So in the introduction to your story, Waterbot, you mentioned the formation of the company Planetary Resources. And yes. I've just seen in the news that it seems like the company's having difficulty. And I was just curious what you think about the near-term prospects for asteroid mining.
That depends on your definition of near-term. I think the asteroid we have already found offer an enormous bonanza of material wealth, and sooner or later we will exploit them. You know, I feel like a kid on the shore of Spain in 1491. The Atlantic Ocean is lapping at my feet, and it's a barrier. Western Europe was occupied by the losers driven out of the rich mainland of Asia and pushed until they couldn't get pushed any farther. They couldn't navigate the Atlantic Ocean, but eventually people built ships, learned how to build ships that could go across the ocean and open up a new frontier. And not just a new frontier of material wealth, but a new frontier of ideas and ways of living. And we're at that point now. We're 100 miles over your head is the frontier of space. And wherever you are, you're only 100 miles from that. That frontier offers tremendous gains, tremendous natural resources of energy and raw materials, enough to make every human being on Earth quite rich. The question is, who's going to go out and claim that stuff, and how's it going to be shared back here on Earth? So we're living in exciting times. It's the beginning of a new age of exploration and development.
Right, and I think people tend to think of space exploration as expensive, but I heard you say that actually the space program has returned more wealth to us than it's cost, even now, even not mining asteroids or anything like that.
Yep. We spent $20 billion in the 60s on Apollo. We have gotten back whole new industries. You know, how much money are cell phones worth? The industrial and the economic benefit of space is way in the black. It's very, very good as returns for what we have spent as tax dollars.
Right, absolutely. And I wish more people were aware of that.
Yeah, I think they know it intellectually, but it hasn't hit them where it counts. But we'll see. Sooner or later, people will be able to buy into space operations as stockholders or as tourists. You know, I've got a character that I've written a lot of short stories about, Sam Gunn. Sam wants to open a tourist hotel in space, and the motto for his hotel is, if you like waterbeds, you're going to love zero gravity.
Right. So Sam Gunn was actually the protagonist of or one of the main characters, I guess, in the golf story I mentioned. Sam
Yes.
blew apart. That's the Sam.
Yes. Sam's a character I've been dealing with for more than 30 years. He's a rogue, an entrepreneur, and he makes money in space and blows it very quickly trying something else.
I heard you say that the character was loosely based on Harlan Ellison?
No, not really. Although I did when I did the first Sam Gunn story, I sent a copy of it to Harlan to make sure he wasn't offended. Because although I haven't based Sam's physical description or his entrepreneurial activity on Harlan, I think a lot of science fiction readers would see similarities.
So what similarities would they see?
A loudmouth, aggressive, skirt-chasing guy who's kind of brilliant.
Where did that name Sam Gunn come from? Because it makes me kind of think of the science fiction author James Gunn.
Yeah, so did James Gunn when he read the story. No, the name just popped into my mind when I was first thinking about it.
There was also a character at one point in the book named Mance Brunner, which made me think of John Brunner. Was that any reference there?
No, not really. I try to avoid getting people upset.
I mean, there was this story, Scheherazade and the Storytellers, where you say a number of the characters.
That was different. The storytellers in that story in ancient Baghdad are sort of funny evocations of contemporary science fiction writers.
Right. So the premise of the story is that Scheherazade needs stories to tell every night, and she's sort of crowdsourcing it, this job to all the storytellers in Baghdad. And you say, that so which science fiction authors kind of make cameos in the story?
Well, I'll leave it to the reader. I don't want to give away the secret, but take a look at the names, and you'll see thinly disguised names of prominent science fiction writers.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, so let's talk about your story, Bloodless Victory. So you have this idea that in the future, court cases might be settled with virtual reality duels rather than court cases. Could you talk about how you came up with that idea?
Oh, dueling is an old concept and was at one time a way for gentlemen to settle their differences. Virtual reality allows you to have a duel without any danger, without any injuries, and except perhaps emotional. And I thought it might be an interesting idea to see if virtual reality duels could replace lawsuits. Our courts today are just overwhelmed with personal lawsuits, most of which are trivial, except to the people involved. So I think VR duels would ease the burden on the courts, provide more emotional satisfaction, and make lawyers poorer, all of which is devoutly to be wished.
So if you had to duel somebody in virtual reality, what sort of duel would it be?
Well, you and your opponent have to get together and decide on a venue for the duel. Do you want to do pistols at 20 paces, or water-filled balloons at arm's length. Once you have agreed on a venue for the duel, you perform the duel in virtual reality.
Right, but I'm asking you personally, which, if you had to choose a weapon, or what do you think you would have the best shot at?
Saber.
Do you have a lot of saber experience?
I used to, a long time ago. But I still got a saber here in my office. I'm looking at it right now. And I think it's an excellent weapon for finding justice.
Have you had any experiences with the legal system where you're like, wow, I would much rather be fighting a duel than dealing with this?
I haven't had much experience with the legal system for a long, long time. But I do think fighting a duel with your opponent would be much more satisfactory, even if you lose.
Yeah, it sort of puts a note of finality on the whole thing.
Yeah. I killed the son of a bitch. Or he killed me.
Yeah. I also wanted to talk to you about, so the story Inspiration features a bunch of historical figures prominently as characters, including Lord Kelvin. And yeah. I thought he's a really interesting character in the story because the story says he was acknowledged by the world as the leading scientific figure of his generation, but he was completely wrong about so many important aspects of science.
Yeah, he really didn't open his eyes to the new possibilities. And meeting the teenage Albert Einstein seemed like a logical thing to do in the story.
Right. So in the story, there's a time traveler, and he is trying to arrange a meeting between H.G. Wells and a young Albert Einstein in hopes that H.G. Wells' ideas about time travel from the time machine will inspire Einstein to come up with the theory of relativity.
Yep. And it works.
Do you remember anything about how you came up with that story or what the genesis of the idea was?
I have to think about that for a minute. But the idea that a young Einstein would be crushed by Kelvin and the rest of organized science, saying that we've just about discovered everything. This generation of scientists will put a few dots over I's and cross a couple of T's, but there's very little new to really be discovered. And that would really upset young Einstein.
I mean, to me in the story, it almost suggested that Einstein believed in the power of imagination in a way that Kelvin didn't, and that set him apart.
You have to remember in the story that Einstein is 16 and Kelvin is, 68 or so. So there's a difference of ages and a difference of outlooks.
Right. But I mean, Kelvin, he's very hostile to the idea. I mean, he's having this conversation with H.G. Wells about the time machine and doesn't want to hear about it at all.
Well, you would get much the same reaction today from most scientists. The time machine sounds kind of absurd.
So have you had experiences like that, writing science fiction, where people are just hostile to the whole enterprise?
I've known people who are hostile to the whole enterprise of science fiction. But as more and more science fiction turns into science fact, I think it's more difficult to complain about it.
One thing you said that struck me is you were talking about how when you were offered the job as the editor of Analog, the publisher said one reason why he chose you is because you were the only candidate whose stories he could understand.
Yeah. And I think that's thanks to my newspaper upbringing. Write clearly. A story should not be a contest between the author and the reader. Make it as easy as you can for the reader, and your ideas will get across better.
I mean, so do you think that in some sense the hostile reception of science fiction is due partly to people just not being able to understand the stories that they're written into?
No, I think the hostile attitude towards science fiction is mainly from people who've never read any science fiction. I think they get their attitudes about science fiction from from seeing the dreadful movies that Hollywood makes.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely true too. Do you think that the Hollywood movies have been getting any better recently?
No, they're just getting more expensive.
Yeah. Another science fiction author you mentioned in the book is Gordon R. Dixon, and
Yes.
You say that his story, Call Him Lord, that the character, the Emperor of the Hundred Worlds, you say that it was as powerful characterization as I have found anywhere.
Yep. Gordy was a wonderful writer. He really was, and a wonderful friend. Although we lived half a continent apart, it was a rare year when we didn't visit each other one way or the other. And I've got a million wonderful stories about Gordy.
I mean, do you want to tell one of those million stories?
All right. A half a dozen of us are in New York. We had dinner at a very nice restaurant. We go outside. It's raining a little. And we hail a taxi cab. We all jam into the cab. And the cab takes us to the hotel where most of the guys were staying. And as we get out, the cab driver starts complaining that we didn't leave him much of a tip. And Gordy turns around and starts talking to the cab driver. It starts out very politely, but the driver was getting snotty. And suddenly I saw Gordy reaching in through the driver's side window, grabbing the guy by the shoulders and starting to pull him out of the cab through the window. And Gordy saying, well, we can settle this like gentlemen. And the cab driver is desperately trying to get the car in gear and drive away. So that was Gordy. Very, very polite, but there came a trigger at some point, and he got rather physical. And although he was a very self-effacing man, Gordy was a sizable guy. And I think the cab driver was sort of semi-terrified.
It sounds like a situation where you would want to have a virtual reality duel.
Yes, exactly.
Could really come in handy there. So talk about what was so powerful about the characterization of the Emperor of the Hundred Worlds.
The ability to be the Emperor of the Hundred Worlds, the ability to make decisions and control destinies. I thought Gordy did a marvelous job with relatively few words of showing that character. And I decided to write a story about him, but I got Gordy's permission first.
Right, so tell us about your story. It's called The Last Decision.
Yep. It's set in the future. There is an empire of 100 worlds. The capital of that empire is not here on Earth or in the solar system. It's on another planet orbiting another star. Earth is kept as a sort of a rural community so that the people of Earth's bloodlines are not altered by civilization. And this is a basis for the genetic studies throughout the empire. Then they find that Earth's sun is going to erupt, going to be a mini nova, and scrub the Earth clean of life. And a young woman, scientist, believes she can save the sun. And the official scientific community doesn't believe her and wants no part of it. It's too different from what they're doing. And she gets to the emperor himself and convinces him to let her try. And that is the Emperor's final gift to the Empire.
So say a bit more about why they're keeping Earth as this preserve. They're trying to make sure that the genetics of the rest of the population on the other worlds doesn't drift too far.
Doesn't vary too much. Right. You caught it on the first bounce.
I mean, do you think that would be, if you were the Emperor, do you think that would be an important thing to do, to not let to keep humanity as one species, basically?
It depends on the attitudes of the time. Do you want to make sure that Earth's various children, as they spread through the galaxy, remain pretty close to the original germline? Or do you want to let them develop into different forms? I think most people, based on what I know of people today, would want human beings to remain as human as possible.
So that, I mean, that's most people, but is that your view? I mean, do you care if humanity speciates or not?
No, I think humanity will deviate. I think all living creatures move along their own developmental lines, and human beings who settle on planets far physically from our own, they will change physically over time.
Right, because it seems to me that especially with genetic engineering, that we're looking at a future where there are different species branches of humanity.
That's possible, unless we decide that we don't want to do it and make that illegal. That could happen.
Right. I mean, one thing that's kind of interesting is that in this universe of The Last Decision, that most people are, or at least most wealthy people are able to get these rejuvenation treatments, but the Emperor has foregone that purposefully. Could you talk about that?
As the Emperor himself says, you wouldn't want me unaltered, for 1,000 years. That way lies a freezing of the Empire's vitality.
Right, because you want younger people coming in, I guess, with new ideas.
Well, look at it this way. Suppose Adolf Hitler had won World War II and lived for 1,000 years. That would be a terrible situation.
Yeah. Well, that's for sure, yeah. I mean, but even if it's not somebody who's bad, just it's hard for people to change their minds over time.
We've seen it in history that ancient kings, as they get older, they get more rigid, less willing to move in a new direction, and the society begins to wither.
I mean, one thing that I sort of wonder about sometimes is, if life extension technology continues to improve, how do you keep society progressing and not just have people's social attitudes and things freeze? And one thing I wonder about is just, could you, after you're 100 years old, do you not have the vote anymore or something, in order that the younger generations coming up are still driving the direction of society? Do you think that that's something that might be wise?
It's an idea for a good science fiction story. I'll say that much for it.
Yeah. Maybe I'll write that sometime.
Good.
Because in addition, because you have another story called In Trust, which also deals with life extension in a way. This one deals with cryonics. And it's kind of this interesting issue of, if you are going to, there's a character in the story, he's a billionaire, and he is diagnosed with fatal cancer. And he's planning to freeze himself, and hopefully in 100 years they'll be able to revive him and cure his cancer. But then the issue is, how does he preserve his fortune through all those decades?
Yeah.
And it really is a tricky problem.
It certainly is, as he finds out. Who can you trust while you're salted away in cryonic suspension.
Right, and so he considers, different insurance policy, like life insurance and the church and stuff. Do you have any? If it were up to you, if you were in that situation, what bet do you think you would take to preserve your fortune?
Why preserve it? Why not use it wisely and put it to good use? Personally, I would put it into space developments.
Right. I mean, that's certainly a more generous way to go.
Yep.
Because it does raise the issue, I guess, that if a lot of people, a lot of wealthy people are having themselves frozen and trying to preserve their wealth, is that just pulling a lot of the resources of society out of circulation in a unproductive sort of way?
I don't think so. I think you preserve your wealth mainly by multiplying it. It doesn't stand still. The world doesn't stand still, and your wealth isn't going to stand still. There's the old joke about the guy who had himself preserved, and he's awakened 100 years in the future. And the first thing he does is call his broker, or the descendants of his broker, and finds that his fortune is now $100 billion. And he's very happy until the operator breaks into the call and says, you've gone overtime on your call. Please deposit another $1 billion.
Well, a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed Gregory Benford, and he's actually a proponent of, I'm sure is a proponent of cryonics. Has he
Yep.
Has he tried to talk you into that?
Nope.
He's never, because he was saying that he had talked to a lot of science fiction authors. He mentioned, I think, Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke, Robert Heinlein, that he had tried to sell them on cryonics.
They were all of a earlier generation, and I don't think they were ready for that, intellectually or emotionally.
I mean, so what do you think about cryonics? Is that something you would ever consider?
I would, yeah. But it's like pilots tell you, never fly a new plane on its first flight. And, don't be the first one to go into cryonics. But sooner or later, many people will, and it might just be a way to extend your life.
So you're waiting for the technology to develop a little bit more before you take the plunge, so to speak?
Yes.
Speaking of Gregory Benford, you actually dedicated this book to him. Do you want to talk a little bit about your relationship with him?
Oh, Greg is an old friend, and although we seldom see each other nowadays, because we live on opposite sides of the country, he is a very, very interesting and charming fellow, and a damn good writer.
Yeah, I really had a good time talking to him. I mean, he's just so smart and knows about so many different subjects.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any stories about him fighting with cab drivers or anything like that?
Not Greg, no.
No, he seemed very agreeable. He seemed like a very agreeable person.
A very sensible person.
So your story, The Question, it starts with an epigraph by Noam Chomsky. He says, as soon as questions of will or decision or reason or choice of action arise, human science is at a loss. Could you just talk about why you chose to start off the story with that quote?
Just to show what a jerk Chomsky is. Science is all about choice, all about enlarging our freedom of action.
So have you ever interacted with Chomsky at all?
No, we've never met.
You ever think about sending him an email, telling him how wrong he is?
No, he doesn't need to hear from me.
I guess I'll ask you, so one of the stories in the book, it's called The Question, and the premise is that there are aliens passing through the solar system, and they offer humanity the chance to ask them one question and only one that they'll answer.
Yeah. It's a good way to tear humanity apart.
Yeah.
Everybody thinks they should have the honor of asking the one question.
Right. Is that how you came up with the idea of the story? You're just like, wow, this would just tear people apart if this were to happen?
Yeah. Yep.
Because different characters, I mean, a lot of the characters in the story, they come up with different, really good questions. How does your star drive work? Some answers to questions in fundamental physics would be good to know. How do we deal with overpopulation, things like that?
Yeah, everybody wants to ask a question that pertains to his special interest and doesn't want anybody else's special interest to get the question.
So I won't spoil the ending of the story, but is the question at the end of the story, is that what you would ask if you had one question, or would you have something else in mind?
The question that is asked at the end of the story is out of sheer desperation. And I wish the human race could do better.
Right, but so that's not... So what would you ask if you had one question you could ask aliens?
That's a good question. I suppose eternal life, or at least life extension.
Mm-hmm. I mean, what do you think about the future that we're headed for? I mean, in the last decision, you mentioned that there's this scientist who petitions the emperor to try to save Earth's sun from total destruction and faces a lot of political opposition. And I felt like that was, symbolic or symptomatic or something of the role of scientists today. Do you feel like, I assume you think that scientists are warning of all these impending catastrophes and are not being heeded the way that they should, or is that how you feel?
Yeah. It's like the boy who cried wolf. Eventually the wolf arrives. And I think we're staring at some very significant problems and paying very little attention to them.
I've heard you say a bunch of times that politicians focus on what's urgent and not on what's important.
Yeah, I think that's the nature of the game. Science looks at what's important, but very often is not paid enough attention in time.
I mean, there was a movement in the last year or two to try to get more scientists to run for public office, to try to get just more scientific expertise into those decision-making conversations. Do you think that's, what do you think about that?
I don't think having the scientists run for public office is going to do much good, because most of them wouldn't know how to do it and would be easily defeated. I think the important thing is to get the politicians to hire good science and get good scientific advice. But most politicians don't understand science or are actively opposed to it.
I mean, I always sort of feel like I hope, my hope is that science fiction will get a broader segment of the public interested in science, and then that'll sort of trickle up to the decision makers in Washington.
Well, what you've got to do to make that vision come true is get control of the educational system across the country. Because kids are taught in school that science is dull and difficult.
Right. And certainly when I don't know if this is different now, but when I was in school, there was just a lot of hostility to science fiction among teachers that I had, which really alienated me as a student. And so, I hope we can get more science fiction into the classroom.
That would help.
All right, let's make that happen.
Okay, you do your part and I'll do mine.
All right, great. So I think that's a good note to end on. So we've been speaking with Ben Bova about his book, New Frontiers. So Ben, thank you so much for joining us.
You made it a pleasure. Thank you.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Ben Bova for joining us on the show. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.